The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Church in fractured jewels of crimson and gold, casting their benediction upon the assembled congregation like a promise of joy to come, and the air hung heavy with the perfume of hothouse roses and orange blossoms that had been arranged in elaborate cascades along every pew, their white petals luminous against the ancient stone. Lady Amelia Hartwell stood at the altar in her wedding gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, the veil her grandmother had worn draped over her dark hair like a gossamer cloud, her hands clutching a bouquet of white camellias so tightly that the stems bruised her palms through her gloves, and she kept her eyes fixed upon the carved wooden cross above the altar, because to look at the assembled guests, the cream of society in their finest morning dress, the women's jewels catching the colored light, the men's expressions ranging from boredom to anticipation, would be to acknowledge what was slowly, inexorably becoming apparent. Time passed with the weight of stone. The vicar cleared his throat once, twice, 3 times, each sound echoing through the vaulted space like a small condemnation, and shifted his weight from foot to foot, his prayer book open to the marriage ceremony, his finger marking the place where he would begin when the bridegroom arrived. If the bridegroom arrived, and that "if" began to take root in the minds of those assembled like a poisonous seed. Whispers started at the back of the church, a rustling susurration like wind through dead leaves, and spread forward through the pews in waves, faces turning to neighbors, gloved hands rising to hide mouths that shaped questions no one wished to speak aloud. The Marquess of Ashford does not arrive. Amelia felt the weight of their stares like physical touches, pitying and shocked and hungry for scandal, and something within her chest began to crack, a fissure spreading through the careful composure she had cultivated since childhood, since she had first understood that a lady's greatest accomplishment was the concealment of every genuine feeling beneath a surface of polished perfection. Her father, Lord Hartwell, stood rigid in the front pew, his face darkening from pink to crimson to a dangerous purple, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with barely suppressed rage, and beside him her mother had begun to weep silently, tears tracking through the powder on her cheeks, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth as though to hold back the sobs that would shatter what remained of their dignity. The vicar approached Amelia with something like kindness in his eyes, that terrible clerical compassion reserved for the dying and the devastated, and spoke in a low voice that somehow carried through the awful silence. "My dear, I believe we must accept that Lord Ashford will not be joining us this morning," and those words, spoken with such gentle finality, transformed possibility into certainty, hope into humiliation, a future into ashes. Amelia stood frozen, every eye upon her, the weight of her abandonment crushing the air from her lungs, and inside her chest her heart was shattering into fragments too small to ever be reassembled, each piece a cutting edge of pain and bewilderment and shame, but her face remained serene as a marble saint's, betraying nothing of the devastation that consumed her from within. With hands that trembled only slightly, so slightly that perhaps no one else noticed, though she felt the tremor like an earthquake, she reached up and removed her veil, lifting it carefully from her hair and folding it with precise movements, each crease exact, and then she walked down the aisle between the assembled guests, with her spine straight and her head high. Though she saw nothing through the film of tears she refused to let fall, felt nothing but the terrible emptiness where her future had been, heard nothing but the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life. 6 months earlier, in the drawing room of Hartwell Manor, where spring sunlight illuminated the careful arrangement of furniture and flowers meant to display both taste and prosperity, Lady Amelia Hartwell had received her first call from the Marquess of Ashford, and even then she had understood with the clarity granted to women who have been raised as commodities to be bartered that this was not a social visit, but an inspection, an evaluation of her suitability for a position that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with advantage. Sebastian Ashford had entered the room with the assurance of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. His tall frame impeccably dressed in charcoal grey that emphasized the austere lines of his face, those cold grey eyes that swept over her with the dispassionate assessment one might give to a promising mare at Tattersall's, taking in her appearance, her posture, the way she held her teacup with steady hands, despite the tremor of nerves that danced along her spine. He required a wife. This much had been made clear through the intermediaries who had arranged this meeting. His position demanded it, society expected it, and there were matters of inheritance and political influence that necessitated the stability of marriage to a woman of appropriate birth and breeding. The Hartwell family needed the alliance with equal desperation, though they clothed that need in the language of honor and tradition. Her father's investments had suffered reversals, her brother's gambling debts mounted with alarming speed, and the Ashford wealth and connections offered salvation from the slow slide toward genteel poverty that terrified her mother more than death itself. Their conversation had been a careful dance of banalities, each response measured and proper, his questions designed to assess her education, her temperament, her understanding of what would be required of a Marchioness. And through it all, Amelia had maintained the serene composure that had been drilled into her since childhood, answering with intelligence tempered by appropriate deference, demonstrating her accomplishments without unseemly pride, and all the while she watched him and saw nothing in those grey eyes but cool calculation. His reputation preceded him like a warning. The Marquess of Ashford was known throughout society as a man incapable of the softer emotions, devoted entirely to the expansion of his estates and the increase of his influence, a brilliant mind, housed in a heart of granite, and the women who had once hoped to capture his attention had long since abandoned such aspirations in favor of gentlemen who might actually feel something beyond acquisition and ambition. The formal courtship that followed their first meeting adhered strictly to propriety while remaining utterly devoid of warmth. He called at the prescribed intervals, sat in their drawing room making perfunctory conversation about weather and politics and the state of the roads, escorted her to the opera, where he watched the stage with more interest than he ever showed her face, and through all these rituals Amelia felt her private dreams of affection, never large, never grandiose, but persistent in their quiet way, withering like flowers deprived of light. She had resigned herself to a loveless marriage, had buried those girlish hopes of companionship and regard beneath layers of practical acceptance, telling herself that many women married for far worse reasons and with far less security than she would enjoy as the Marchioness of Ashford. And if her heart cried out against this cold future, well, she had learned long ago that a lady's heart was the least important organ in the intricate machinery of social advancement. Weeks after the wedding debacle, when the first shock had faded into the dull ache of sustained humiliation, Amelia discovered that social ruin arrived not as a single devastating blow, but as 1,000 small cuts, each one drawing blood from her already wounded dignity. Former friends who had once called regularly now sent their regrets through servants, citing sudden illnesses or unexpected travel with voices that barely concealed their relief at having an excuse to avoid her, and invitations that had once arrived daily in cream envelopes sealed with wax simply ceased, her social calendar emptying like water through cupped hands until there was nothing left but blank pages, stretching into an equally blank future. The whispers followed her everywhere. She dared venture to the modiste, where she'd once been greeted with enthusiasm and was now served with barely concealed pity, to the park where she walked and felt eyes tracking her progress like spectators at a tragedy, to church where even the vicar's wife could not quite meet her gaze, and each whispered speculation about what she had done to drive away the Marquess, what hidden flaw or secret shame had been discovered, carved another piece from her already shattered sense of self. Her family's shame manifested differently, but no less painfully. Her father's rage had cooled into a terrible silence, his disappointment hanging over the household like a miasma, and he could barely look at her without his jaw tightening, his hands clenching, as though the sight of her reminded him of the alliance lost, the debts unpaid, the social standing that slipped further from their grasp with each passing day. Her mother wept frequently and without warning, dissolving into tears over dinner or during morning calls from the few loyal friends who still visited, and these tears felt like accusations, each one a reminder that Amelia had somehow failed in the one task for which she had been carefully prepared her entire life. Amelia retreated to their countryside estate in Surrey, seeking in solitude what she could no longer find in society, some measure of peace, some space to breathe without feeling the weight of judgment and speculation, crushing her chest and her parents, perhaps grateful to remove the visible reminder of their disappointment from London's scrutiny, agreed readily to her self-imposed exile. The estate, with its gardens gone slightly wild and its fewer servants, felt like sanctuary after the suffocating falseness of town, and she spent her days walking the grounds in old dresses that no longer mattered, her hair coming loose from its pins without anyone to see or care. her face free of the careful composure she had maintained for so long that it had felt like a mask grown into her skin. Her internal struggle followed her even here, away from society's judgment. The humiliation warred constantly with a residual hurt that cut deeper than shame. The terrible knowledge that he had not even cared enough to offer explanation had simply vanished, as though their months of courtship and the promises implicit in their engagement had meant nothing, as though she herself had meant nothing, and this casual cruelty wounded her more profoundly than the public abandonment because it suggested she was not even worth the courtesy of honesty. She attempted to rebuild herself through small acts of reclamation, planting bulbs in the garden that would bloom in spring when surely this pain would have faded, reading the books she had never had time for during the social season, teaching herself to find solace in her own company, since it seemed that was all she would have for the foreseeable future. And during the days she almost convinced herself that she possessed the strength to survive this, that she would not let this break her, that she would find a way to construct a life from the ruins of her expectations. But each night brought tears she hid even from herself, burying her face in her pillow so that even the walls would not hear her grief, weeping not just for the public shame or the lost position, but for the private dreams she had begun, against all wisdom, to nurture during those formal courtship calls, the foolish hope that perhaps beneath his cold exterior lay a man capable of regard, and the devastating realization that she had been wrong, that she had meant so little that he could abandon her without a word, without a thought, without even the basic respect one would show a stranger. Sebastian Ashford sat in the darkened study of his London townhouse, the curtains drawn against the afternoon light that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the desolation that consumed him, and the brandy decanter on the desk before him was already half empty, though the clock had barely struck 3, each glass burning down his throat without bringing the oblivion he sought, only a fuzzy-edged clarity that made his self-loathing sharper rather than dulling it as he'd hoped. The morning of the wedding returned to him in fragments that cut like glass the letter that had arrived with his breakfast tray, cream paper sealed with anonymous black wax, and he could still see the words, though he'd burned the vile thing in a fit of rage. Lady Amelia has been carrying on a liaison with your brother Julian these past months. The courtship with you merely a pretense to secure the title, while she continues her true affection elsewhere, and you are being made a fool before all of society. His pride, that damned pride that had always been both his armor and his prison, had reared up with such force that rational thought became impossible, and the pain, oh, the pain had been unbearable because somewhere during those formal calls and stilted conversations he had begun to care for her in ways that terrified him, had noticed the intelligence in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, the dry humor she suppressed beneath proper responses, the grace with which she moved through the world, and he had started to believe that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something more, something real, something he'd never expected to want. The thought that she had been deceiving him, using him, playing him for a fool while carrying on with Julian of all people, his charming, affable brother, who had always possessed the easy warmth that Sebastian lacked, had felt like a knife between his ribs, and rather than confront her, rather than demand the truth and risk confirming the betrayal, he had fled like a coward, sent word that he was called away on urgent business, and left her standing at the altar, because facing her had seemed impossible when he could barely breathe through the agony of imagined treachery. Now, weeks later, with brandy singing bitter songs in his blood, doubt plagued him with increasing insistence, whispering that perhaps he had been too hasty, too willing to believe the worst, and Julian's behavior, these past weeks, struck him as odd in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His brother had been too attentive, too quick to offer sympathy, too smug beneath the veneer of brotherly concern, and there was something in his eyes when Sebastian's suffering was mentioned that looked unsettlingly like satisfaction. Sebastian's realization, arriving with the slow horror of watching a structure collapse, was that he had begun to care for Amelia far more than he'd admitted even to himself, that the prospect of loving her and losing her had been so terrifying that when presented with evidence of betrayal, his wounded pride and aching heart had seized the excuse to run rather than risk the vulnerability that true feeling demanded, and in his cowardice he had destroyed an innocent woman's life, and quite possibly his only chance at the happiness he'd spent 30 years pretending he didn't want or need. Sebastian's investigation began with a clarity born of desperation. the fog of brandy and self-pity burning away in the harsh light of doubt that grew stronger with each passing day, and he summoned to his townhouse a discreet inquiry agent named Pritchard, who came highly recommended for his ability to uncover truth without drawing attention, a thin man with shrewd eyes who listened to Sebastian's halting explanation without judgment and simply nodded when asked to determine the veracity of the letter's claims. The agent set to work with methodical precision, interviewing servants from both households under various pretexts, reviewing correspondence that Sebastian provided access to through his considerable influence, tracking Julian's movements during the courtship months through a combination of social calendar reconstruction and careful questioning of those who might have observed the alleged liaison, and each piece of evidence that returned to Sebastian's desk contradicted the letter's poisonous claims with increasing definitiveness. Amelia and Julian had barely known each other. The servants confirmed they had been introduced only twice, both times at formal gatherings with dozens of witnesses present, and their conversations had been brief and proper, observed by chaperones and other guests, with no opportunity for the intimacy the letter suggested, and certainly no indication of affection beyond basic courtesy. The correspondence review revealed nothing remotely suspicious in Amelia's letters to friends and family, only the careful optimism of a young woman entering into an arranged marriage with cautious hope that it might become something more. And Julian's social calendar showed him occupied elsewhere on most occasions when he supposedly would have been conducting this affair, his time accounted for by club memberships and mistresses of his own, whose existence Pritchard documented with uncomfortable thoroughness. Sebastian's growing horror at what he had done manifested physically. He could not sleep, could barely eat, spent hours staring at the evidence that proved Amelia's complete innocence and his own catastrophic failure, and the letter itself haunted him until one sleepless night he retrieved it from where he'd saved the charred fragments, smoothing them out with shaking hands and studying the handwriting with a nagging sense of familiarity he could not quite place, something about the formation of certain letters that whispered of recognition just beyond conscious reach. His pride, that damned pride that had always been his shield and his prison, had made him believe the worst without question, had seized upon the letter as confirmation of his deepest fear that he was unlovable, that any affection shown him must be false, that he did not deserve the happiness that had seemed to shimmer just within reach. And in believing this, he had destroyed an innocent woman's life, and quite possibly his own chance, at the very happiness his wounded pride insisted he could never possess. This was his first true emotional reckoning, the moment when he could no longer hide behind justifications or wounded feelings, when he had to face squarely what he had done, abandoned a blameless woman at the altar, subjected her to public humiliation and social ruin, robbed her of her reputation and her future, all because he had been too cowardly to confront her, too afraid of vulnerability to risk the conversation that might have revealed the truth, too trapped in his own fear of feeling to choose trust over suspicion, and the weight of this knowledge sat on his chest like a stone, making each breath an effort and each moment of consciousness an exercise in self-loathing that he knew he deserved and would deserve for however long he lived, with the consequences of his cowardice. The breakthrough came on a grey Thursday afternoon when Sebastian was reviewing the charred letter fragments for perhaps the 100th time, and the handwriting's nagging familiarity suddenly crystallized into recognition, the peculiar way the capital M looped back on itself, the sharp downward stroke of the Y, the overly elaborate flourish on the S, and he strode to his desk with sudden purpose, retrieving from a drawer the stack of correspondence he'd received over the years from various family members, his hands shaking slightly as he sorted through until he found what he sought. Letters from his cousin Margaret Ashford, and the handwriting matched perfectly despite her obvious attempt to disguise it, the underlying habits of penmanship too ingrained to fully conceal. Margaret, who had been raised alongside him after her parents' death, who had always assumed with unshakable conviction that she would become his wife, who had grown cold and distant when he announced his engagement to Amelia, and whose absence from the wedding he had barely noticed in his own turmoil, but now struck him as significant, deliberate, the absence of someone who could not bear to witness what she had destroyed. Sebastian arrived at Margaret's townhouse in Mayfair with the letter fragments and her correspondence in hand, his rage a cold, controlled thing that made his voice deadly quiet when her butler showed him to the drawing room where she sat taking tea, and she looked up at his entrance, with an expression that flickered between false innocence and something darker, more satisfied, before settling into brittle composure. "Sebastian, what an unexpected," she began, but he cut her off by placing the evidence on the table before her, the charred fragments beside her own letters, and watched as the color drained from her face before returning in two bright spots of defiant anger on her cheekbones. Her confession, when it came after a tense silence broken only by the clock's relentless ticking, was venomous and unrepentant. She had loved him her entire life, had been promised by her dying mother that she would be his marchioness, and when he chose that insipid Hartwell girl instead, Margaret had wanted to punish them both, had known his pride well enough to understand that an accusation of betrayal would send him fleeing, had watched with satisfaction as the wedding collapsed and Amelia's reputation crumbled, and she would do it again because they had deserved the pain for daring to steal the future that should have been hers. Sebastian's cold fury manifested in words that fell like hammer blows. She was banished from all Ashford properties effective immediately. Her allowance from the family coffers ceased. Her name would be stricken from family gatherings, and her presence would not be tolerated in any house or estate under his control. And if she ever attempted to contact him or Amelia again, he would expose her machinations to all of society and ensure she was ruined as thoroughly as she had sought to ruin an innocent woman. Margaret's face twisted with impotent rage, but she could say nothing because they both knew he held all the power, all the authority, and her gambit had failed to win her anything but exile and his eternal contempt. As Sebastian left her townhouse, his hands were shaking, not with anger now, but with the full realization of the magnitude of harm that had been done. How many lives had been shattered by one woman's jealous spite and his own willingness to believe the worst, rather than trust what his heart had been trying to tell him, and he knew now with perfect clarity that he must find a way to make amends to Amelia, though forgiveness might be impossible, must at least offer her the truth and his abject apology even if she turned him away forever, must try to repair the irreparable, because the alternative was living with this crushing guilt and the knowledge that he had destroyed his one chance at happiness through cowardice and pride. And so he made his decision standing on the street outside Margaret's house with the autumn wind cutting through his coat. He would go to Amelia not with excuses or justifications, but with simple truth, would lay before her everything he had learned and everything he had failed to be, and would accept whatever judgment she deemed him worthy of receiving. Sebastian arrived at the Hartwell countryside estate on an October afternoon when autumn had fully claimed the landscape, the trees ablaze with copper and gold that seemed to mock the devastation in his heart, leaves falling in steady spirals like his hopes drifting down to earth with no possibility of rising again, and the long drive up to the manor stretched before him like a judgment he would have to endure with each measured step of his horse's hooves on the gravel path that crunched beneath like breaking bones. The estate looked peaceful in the slanting afternoon light, smoke curling from chimneys, the gardens still maintaining some semblance of their summer glory, though frost had begun its inevitable work, and Sebastian's chest constricted with the knowledge that somewhere within those walls was the woman whose life he had shattered, who had every right to refuse him even the smallest audience, who owed him nothing but contempt, and yet for whom he would endure any humiliation if it meant the chance to speak his truth. The butler who answered his knock at the door took one look at Sebastian's face, and his expression hardened into stone. Recognition and disapproval warring in features trained to impassivity, and when Sebastian requested, not demanded, requested, his voice stripped of all the authority, his title usually commanded to see Lady Amelia. The butler's refusal was both polite and absolute. "Lady Amelia is not receiving visitors, my lord, and I have specific instructions that you are not to be admitted under any circumstances." Sebastian had expected this, had known it was the least of what he deserved, but the words still struck like physical blows, and he asked only if he might leave a letter, might convey his desperate need to speak with her, but the butler's expression remained immovable as he began to close the door, and Sebastian stepped back before it shut in his face, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door closing on all his hopes. He turned away from the door, his vision blurring slightly though, whether from emotion or the autumn wind he could not say, and it was then, glancing up at the manor's windows in one last desperate sweep, that he saw her, Amelia, standing in what must be the morning room, pale as alabaster in a dress of deep blue, a book in her hands, though she was not reading, but rather staring out at the gardens with an expression of such profound melancholy that his heart cracked anew at the sight of her suffering he had caused through his cowardice and pride. Their eyes met for one suspended moment across the distance, and he saw her visible flinch, saw the book slip from her fingers to fall unheeded to the floor, saw her take an involuntary step backward as though his mere presence caused her pain. And then she turned away sharply, disappearing from view, and Sebastian stood frozen on the drive, feeling as though he had been struck, because that flinch, that instinctive recoil told him, more clearly than any words, the depth of the wound he had inflicted, the fear or revulsion or simple pain that his face now inspired in her. He could not stay here, could not camp on their doorstep like some sort of desperate supplicant, but neither could he leave, could not return to London and live with the knowledge that he had not tried everything within his power to make amends. And so he rode back to the village and took rooms at the modest inn, an establishment far beneath his usual standards, but close enough to the estate that he could maintain his vigil, could at least remain near her, even if she would not see him. The days that followed established a pattern that became both his penance and his purpose. Each morning he rode to the estate gates, always stopping there rather than approaching the house again, and he would wait for some sign, some acknowledgement, though none ever came. He wrote letters, not justifications or excuses, but simple truths. His investigation's findings, Margaret's betrayal, his own culpability laid bare without defense, and left them with the gatekeeper, an elderly man who accepted them with increasing pity, but never with any assurance they would be read. And Sebastian suspected they were destroyed, unopened, burned perhaps, or simply discarded, his words never reaching the eyes for which they were intended. Amelia's father appeared on the third day of this vigil, striding down the drive with rage in every line of his body, and the threat he delivered was both creative and sincere. If Sebastian did not remove himself from the vicinity immediately, Lord Hartwell would personally horsewhip him through the village and damn the scandal it would cause, because his daughter had suffered enough at Ashford hands, and he would see Sebastian in hell before allowing him to torment her further with his unwanted presence. Sebastian endured this with bowed head and steady voice, saying only, "I deserve that, and worse, my lord, but I cannot leave until she knows the truth, until I have at least tried to explain and apologize for the unforgivable harm I have done her." And Lord Hartwell's face had purpled with fury, but also perhaps with a reluctant recognition of Sebastian's obvious suffering, though it did not soften his resolve to see Sebastian gone. Yet Sebastian remained, day after day, enduring the contempt of the servants who saw him at the gates, the whispers of villagers who recognized the Marquess of Ashford reduced to keeping vigil like a lovesick boy, the cutting wind and early frosts that signaled winter's approach. And through it all he stayed, because the alternative, abandoning her a second time, even to spare her his unwanted presence, was unthinkable, because he was driven by a desperate need not to win her back, for he knew he had no right to hope for that, but simply to ensure she knew the truth, knew that she had been innocent and wronged, knew that he took full responsibility for the destruction of her reputation and her peace, and that if he could undo any of it by any means, including the sacrifice of his own life or position or comfort, he would do so without hesitation. This being the least of what he owed the woman he had abandoned at the altar, the woman he now understood with crushing clarity that he loved, had perhaps loved even then, though he had been too proud and too frightened to recognize the feeling until it was too late and he had destroyed any chance of her ever returning it. Lord Julian Ashford arrived at the Hartwell estate on a crisp November morning, when the first frost had silvered the remaining garden flowers and the sky hung low and grey with the promise of winter, his carriage fine and his manner impeccable as he presented himself at the door with expressions of fraternal concern and gentlemanly sympathy, claiming he had come to inquire after Lady Amelia's well-being and to offer his sincere apologies for his brother's unconscionable behaviour, his voice pitched perfectly between outrage on her behalf and sorrowful embarrassment at bearing the Ashford name. Amelia received him in the drawing-room with her mother present as propriety demanded. Her initial response, one of discomfort at entertaining the brother of the man who had destroyed her, but Julian's manner was so solicitous, so carefully respectful, that she found herself unable to refuse his visit without appearing churlish. And besides, she reasoned, He could hardly be blamed for Sebastian's sins, could he? Julian had always been the charming one, the brother who smiled easily and spoke with warmth where Sebastian had been cold and remote, and now he wielded that charm like a carefully honed weapon, expressing his horror at what had transpired, his assurances that he had always thought her a lady of the highest character, his rage at his brother's treatment of her, and his fervent wish that there was something, anything, he might do to ease her suffering or restore even a fraction of what had been taken from her. What Amelia could not see, what only the readers might perceive in the calculation behind his sympathetic eyes, was the intricate web Julian had woven with their cousin Margaret months before. How he had planted the seeds of the plan in Margaret's jealous mind, had helped her craft the letter that would destroy the engagement, had positioned himself perfectly to swoop in as the compassionate alternative once Sebastian had fled, all of it orchestrated with the cold precision of a man who had spent his entire life watching his elder brother inherit everything by accident of birth, and had finally found a way to claim what he believed should have been his. Julian had never cared particularly about Amelia herself. She was merely a means to an end, a valuable piece on the chessboard of his ambition. But if he could win her affection and eventually her hand, he would gain not only her considerable dowry and connections, but also the exquisite satisfaction of taking from Sebastian something his brother had wanted. And beyond that, Julian had longer plans, still plans that involved scandal and manipulation, and ultimately challenging Sebastian's position itself. Plans that required Amelia as an ally and a shield, and eventually, once she had served her purpose, as a tragic casualty of the war between brothers. He began calling regularly, always with some small gift or thoughtful gesture, always perfectly timed to seem spontaneous rather than calculated. And Amelia, isolated in her grief and confusion, found herself almost grateful for the company, even as something in her recoiled slightly from his excessive attention, from the way his hand would linger just a moment too long when helping her from a chair, from the too familiar manner in which he spoke to her, as though they were intimate friends rather than bare acquaintances. Julian's campaign was patient and methodical. He spoke often of Sebastian's failings, his coldness, his inability to appreciate what he had been given, and he contrasted these with gentle implications of his own different nature, his capacity for warmth and devotion, his understanding of what a woman like Amelia deserved, and all the while his mind calculated the steps ahead, the precise moment when he would declare himself, the way he would position the marriage as her salvation and his defiance of his unworthy brother, the social rehabilitation it would bring her, and the power it would bring him. Amelia, for her part, accepted his visits with polite reserve, not recognizing the manipulation because she was too lost in her own pain to see clearly, too starved for any human connection that wasn't tinged with pity or scandal to question the convenience of his sudden devoted attention, and so Julian's presence at the estate became a regular occurrence, even as Sebastian kept his lonely vigil at the gates. The two brothers engaged in parallel campaigns for vastly different reasons. One, driven by desperate love and genuine remorse, the other by cold ambition and the intoxicating prospect of finally eclipsing the brother who had always cast him in shadow. Sebastian learned of Julian's presence at the Hartwell estate through the village gatekeeper, an elderly man who had come to regard Sebastian's daily vigils with a sort of pitying familiarity, and who mentioned in passing that Lord Julian's fine carriage had been seen on the drive several times in recent days, and the words struck Sebastian like a physical blow, his entire body going cold. Despite the November wind, as pieces suddenly began connecting in his mind with terrible clarity. Julian's behavior in the weeks before the wedding, that smug satisfaction barely concealed beneath expressions of fraternal sympathy when Sebastian had confessed his doubts. The two quick offers to call upon Miss Hartwell and ensure she understands the family's regret, and most damning of all, Julian's intimate knowledge of their cousin Margaret's temperament and vulnerabilities, the way he had steered conversations toward her jealous nature as though planting seeds, as though preparing ground for something Sebastian had been too blind and too devastated to recognize. The realization crashed over him with the force of a winter storm. This had been a conspiracy, a calculated plot between Julian and Margaret to destroy his engagement, and Julian, his own brother, his own blood, had orchestrated the entire catastrophe, not out of any sense of justice or family loyalty, but out of base ambition and the toxic resentment of a younger son who had always lived in shadow and had finally found a way to step into light by pushing Sebastian into darkness. Sebastian's hands trembled as he mounted his horse, his mind racing through implications and dangers. Julian was even now with Amelia, playing the role of sympathetic comforter, positioning himself as the caring alternative to his cold elder brother. And Amelia, in her isolation and pain, would have no reason to suspect manipulation, no cause to question the motives of a man who presented himself as her ally and advocate. He must warn her, must find some way to expose Julian's true nature before his brother could sink his claws deeper into her trust, before Julian could complete whatever plan he had set in motion with the wedding's destruction as merely the opening gambit. But how could Sebastian reach her when she would not see him, would not read his letters, when every attempt at communication had been rebuffed by servants and family who believed him the villain of this tragedy? His desperation mounted as he rode back to the inn through gathering dusk, his mind working frantically through options and obstacles, and finally he sat at the small writing desk in his rented room and began to write, not a plea for forgiveness or understanding, but a detailed exposure of Julian's character and actions. Everything his investigation had uncovered about the conspiracy with Margaret, his suspicions about Julian's deeper involvement based on behavior and knowledge only a co-conspirator would possess, his certainty that Julian's sudden devoted attention to Amelia was not compassion, but calculation, another move in whatever larger game his brother was playing. Sebastian wrote with brutal honesty, holding nothing back about his own failures and cowardice. He had already confessed these in previous letters, but he reiterated them now to establish his credibility, to show that he was not deflecting blame or making excuses, but simply trying to protect Amelia from further harm, even if she never forgave him for the initial wound, and he included every scrap of evidence he possessed, every detail that might help her see the truth beneath Julian's charming facade. Every warning sign Sebastian himself had been too proud and too hurt to recognize until it was nearly too late. When he finished, well past midnight with candles burning low and his hand cramping from the intensity of his writing, he sealed the letter with trembling fingers and sat staring at it in the flickering light, knowing that this might be his only chance to reach her, to warn her, to protect her even from a distance when she would not allow him close, and he knew he must find a way to deliver it, past the defenses that had turned back all his previous attempts, must ensure it reached her hands rather than being destroyed unopened, because if Julian succeeded in whatever scheme he had devised, if Amelia fell victim to manipulation while Sebastian stood helplessly outside her gates, then the destruction Sebastian had caused through his abandonment would pale beside the ongoing harm his failure to act would enable, and that was a burden his already shattered conscience could not possibly bear. The letter reached Amelia through her lady's maid, Lucy, a young woman who had served her since childhood and who had witnessed the daily vigil. Sebastian kept at the gates with an increasingly sympathetic eye, for Lucy had seen the Marquess standing in wind and rain with the patient stillness of a penitent, had noticed the genuine anguish in his posture when he caught glimpses of her mistress through windows, and had finally taken pity on his obvious desperation when he pressed the sealed letter into her hands one grey November afternoon with a plea that transcended pride. "Please, I beg you, let her read this one. She needn't respond. She needn't ever speak to me again. But she must know the truth about my brother before it's too late." And something in his voice, raw and broken, had moved Lucy to tuck the letter into her apron and carry it upstairs that evening when she attended Amelia in her bedchamber. Amelia stood by the window in her nightdress, her dark hair unbound and falling past her shoulders, candlelight casting shadows across her pale face as Lucy presented the letter with quiet insistence that perhaps, just perhaps, her ladyship might consider reading what his lordship had written, for he seemed a man truly suffering and not the callous villain they had all believed. And Amelia's first instinct was refusal, her hand drawing back from the folded paper as though it might burn her. But Lucy's gentle persistence and her own exhausted curiosity finally won over her resistance, and she took the letter with trembling fingers and broke the seal as Lucy withdrew to give her privacy. The words swam before her eyes at first, emotion making it difficult to focus, but gradually Sebastian's voice emerged from the careful script, raw, honest, stripped of all pretense and pride, as he laid bare everything he had discovered, everything he had come to understand too late, beginning with his own shameful failures and the anonymous letter that had destroyed their wedding day, his confession that he had been falling in love with her during their courtship and had not known how to reconcile his growing feelings with his lifelong conviction that he was incapable of such emotion, that the letter's claims had devastated him precisely because they had mattered so intensely. But he took full responsibility for his cowardice in fleeing rather than confronting her with his doubts, for believing the worst without question because his pride had been so thoroughly wounded. Then the letter shifted to his investigation, detailing with methodical precision how every claim in that anonymous letter had proven false, how Amelia and Julian had barely known each other and certainly never been alone together, how he had eventually traced the letter to their cousin Margaret and confronted her to obtain a full confession of her jealous plot to destroy the engagement. And here Sebastian's words grew more urgent as he laid out his suspicions about Julian's deeper involvement, the too convenient timing of Julian's appearances, his intimate knowledge of Margaret's vulnerabilities, his smug satisfaction at the wedding's failure that Sebastian had been too devastated to recognize as complicity, his immediate and excessive attention to Amelia in the aftermath that spoke not of genuine sympathy, but of calculated positioning. Sebastian warned her with desperate clarity that Julian was not what he seemed, that his brother's current courtship was manipulation rather than honest affection, that Julian had orchestrated the entire catastrophe for his own ambitions, and now sought to complete his scheme by winning Amelia's trust and eventually her hand. And Sebastian begged her to observe Julian carefully, to question his stories and his motives, to protect herself, even if she could never forgive Sebastian for failing to protect her when it had mattered most, his words concluding not with pleas for reconciliation, but with simple, abject apology, and the fervent wish that she might at least be spared further harm, even if Sebastian himself remained forever unforgiven. Amelia read the letter twice, then a third time as candles burned lower and the night deepened around her. Her emotions, a storm of confusion and pain-fury at Sebastian's abandonment, still burned hot in her chest, the humiliation of standing alone at that altar still fresh enough to make her hands shake. But beneath the anger she recognized something troubling in his words, a ring of desperate truth that resonated with her own vague discomforts about Julian's attention, and as she sat in the flickering candlelight, reviewing every interaction she'd had with Julian through this new lens of suspicion, details began standing out with uncomfortable clarity. The way Julian's sympathy had always felt slightly performative, as though he were playing a role rather than expressing genuine feeling, the excessive familiarity of his manner that had made her subtly recoil even as she'd told herself she was being ungracious, the inconsistencies in his stories about his relationship with Margaret and his whereabouts during her courtship with Sebastian, small contradictions she had dismissed at the time, but which now seemed potentially significant. She could not simply accept Sebastian's claims without question. Trust had been too thoroughly shattered for that, but neither could she dismiss them, and so she resolved to watch Julian more carefully during his next visit, to test his stories with pointed questions and observe his reactions, to see for herself whether Sebastian's warnings held merit or were merely the desperate inventions of a man seeking to redirect blame, though in her heart, in the deep places she tried not to examine too closely, she suspected she already knew which possibility was true, for Sebastian's suffering in his letter had been too genuine, too self-condemning to be anything but honest, and that recognition brought its own complicated anguish because it meant the man who had destroyed her had done so not from cruelty or indifference, but from wounded love and catastrophic pride, which somehow made the whole tragedy even more painful to bear. Julian arrived at the Hartwell estate on a grey December morning when frost still clung to the garden paths and bare branches traced skeletal patterns against the lowering sky, and Amelia received him in the drawing room with careful courtesy that masked the new wariness Sebastian's letter had awakened in her. Watching Julian's handsome face and smooth manners with the careful attention one might give to a beautiful but potentially venomous creature whose true nature remained uncertain, he suggested a turn in the garden despite the cold, claiming he had matters of some delicacy to discuss, and Amelia agreed with her maid as chaperone, wrapping herself in a heavy cloak as they descended the terrace. Steps into the winter-bare landscape, where roses had been cut back to stumps and the fountain stood silent and drained, their breath misting in the frigid air, as Julian began speaking with what seemed like carefully rehearsed spontaneity about how much her company had come to mean to him, how his visits to offer familial support had revealed depths of admiration and affection he had not anticipated, and then quite suddenly he stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression of earnest devotion that might have been convincing had she not been studying him with such focused scrutiny. "Miss Hartwell, Amelia, if I may, I find I can no longer remain silent about what has grown in my heart these past weeks," he said, taking her gloved hand in his with a pressure just slightly too firm, his eyes searching her face as though seeking confirmation of her vulnerability. Her need, "I have loved you from afar even before my brother's, forgive me, my brother's unconscionable abandonment, and now I find myself in the extraordinary position of being able to offer you what Sebastian threw away. Not merely my name and protection, but genuine devotion. The restoration of your position in society through alliance with me, a future built on mutual regard rather than cold arrangement." His speech was perfectly crafted, each word chosen for maximum emotional impact, and Amelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with December's bite as she recognized the calculated performance beneath the romantic declaration, Sebastian's warnings echoing in her mind with growing resonance. She withdrew her hand gently and asked with deceptive mildness, "You say you have loved me even before the wedding that did not occur? How curious, as we had met only twice before that day, and always in the company of others. When precisely did this affection take root?" She watched his face carefully as she spoke, and though his expression remained one of tender devotion, something flickered behind his eyes, a flash of annoyance at the unexpected question, at her failure to respond with the grateful acceptance he had clearly anticipated. He recovered quickly, laughing as though her precision amused him. "A man may admire from a distance, may he not? I noticed you at various gatherings, heard reports of your grace and character, and when Sebastian announced his intention to marry you, I confess I felt the sting of having waited too long to make my own interest known. But the explanation rang false, too smooth and too convenient, and Amelia pressed further with the pointed questions Sebastian's letter had suggested, asking about Julian's relationship with their cousin Margaret, whether he had seen her around the time of the failed wedding, what he knew of her feelings toward Sebastian's engagement. Julian's mask slipped further with each query, his smile growing fixed and his eyes hardening with barely suppressed anger as he realized she was not the broken, grateful victim he had expected, but rather a woman alert to deception and unwilling to be manipulated. And finally, when she asked directly where he had been on her wedding morning and whether he had known in advance that Sebastian would not appear, his facade cracked entirely. "What has Sebastian been telling you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with sudden fury, his grip on her arm tightening until it became painful as he stepped closer with a threatening intensity that transformed his handsome features into something ugly and cruel. "That interfering fool, he cannot leave well enough alone even after destroying his own chances. Has he been filling your head with suspicions, trying to poison you against me out of jealous spite?" Amelia tried to pull away, but his fingers dug into her arm through the heavy cloak, and she saw in that unguarded moment of rage the complete truth of what Sebastian had warned. This was no devoted suitor, but a calculating predator, whose charm had been merely a tool for manipulation, whose entire courtship had been strategy rather than affection, and the recognition filled her with cold fear as Julian continued speaking, his words vicious now that pretense had been abandoned. "You should be grateful for my attention. You ruined little fool, you are damaged goods now, scorned by society, pitied at best and mocked at worst, and I am offering you a way back to respectability when you deserve nothing but the obscurity your humiliation has earned you." Sebastian had taken rooms at the village inn, where he maintained his daily vigil, and on that grey December morning he stood at his window, overlooking the road to the Hartwell estate, with the restless vigilance of a sentry who knows danger approaches but cannot yet see its form, and when he observed Julian's distinctive carriage rolling past toward the estate gates, his entire body went rigid with alarm, as instinct screamed, warning through every nerve Julian would not make a casual call on such a bitter day, without purpose, and Sebastian's growing certainty that his brother had orchestrated the entire catastrophe with Margaret made this visit feel suddenly, urgently dangerous in ways he could not fully articulate, but felt with absolute conviction. Without pausing for hat or gloves, without regard for propriety or the restraining orders Amelia's father had threatened, Sebastian strode from the inn and began walking rapidly toward the estate, his pace increasing to a run as dread mounted in his chest, and he arrived at the gates breathing hard and pushed through without announcement, ignoring the startled groundskeeper's protests as he followed some nameless instinct toward the winter garden where he and Amelia had once walked during their stiff, formal courtship. The scene that met his eyes ignited a rage so pure and absolute, it transcended anything he had known in his carefully controlled life. Julian, gripping Amelia's arm with bruising force, his handsome face twisted with ugly fury as he spat vicious words about her ruined state and how she should be grateful for his attention, and Amelia, pale and frightened, but meeting Julian's anger with desperate dignity, even as she tried futilely to pull away from his punishing grasp. Sebastian's vision narrowed to a tunnel of protective fury as he crossed the frozen garden in 4 long strides and seized Julian's shoulder, wrenching him away from Amelia with such force that Julian stumbled backward, and the brothers faced each other across 3 feet of frost-hard ground, with years of rivalry and jealousy suddenly crystallized into this single moment of ultimate betrayal. Julian recovered his balance, and his composure cracked into something almost gleeful as he recognized the confrontation he had perhaps always wanted, always worked toward in subtle ways throughout their lives. Ah, the prodigal brother arrives to play hero. How touching. Sebastian, though rather late considering you're the one who destroyed her first. Sebastian's hands clenched into fists as he fought for control, his voice emerging low and dangerous. You orchestrated this. All of it. With Margaret. The letter, the wedding, your calculated courtship. You wanted to take everything I had, to watch me destroy it myself, and then claim the pieces. Julian's smile was a terrible thing, acknowledgement and mockery combined. Always so clever, brother, yet not clever enough to see what was happening until it was too late. Yes, I orchestrated your downfall. I wanted your title and your position, and yes, I wanted her too. Wanted to take the wife you didn't deserve and make her grateful to me instead. Wanted finally to step out of your perfect shadow and claim what should have been mine from birth if I'd only had the fortune to be born first. The confession hung in the frigid air like poison, and Sebastian felt something fundamental break loose inside him. All the careful control and cold logic that had defined his existence shattering under the weight of this betrayal, and when Julian made a dismissive gesture and turned as though to approach Amelia again, Sebastian's restraint ended entirely. He lunged forward and drove his fist into Julian's jaw with all the force of his fury and pain and desperate need to protect what he had failed to protect before, and Julian staggered but came back swinging, and the fight began in earnest, raw and brutal, and stripped of all gentlemanly pretense, as they crashed together with years of resentment finally given physical form. They fought with the savage intensity of men, for whom words had become wholly insufficient, their bodies crashing through the winter garden with brutal momentum that sent them careening into the stone fountain's edge, and through dormant rose beds where frozen earth offered no cushion, and this was not the refined violence of a gentleman's duel with its rules and seconds and honorable distance, but rather something primal and desperate, fists connecting with flesh in impacts that echoed across the frozen landscape, as decades of rivalry and resentment found physical expression in each blow exchanged. Julian fought with the cunning of a man who had always relied on manipulation rather than direct confrontation, using dirty tactics without hesitation, striking at Sebastian's throat, attempting to gouge at his eyes, kicking viciously at his knees, fighting as he had always lived, without honor or constraint, seeking vulnerable points with calculated cruelty, born of ambition that recognized no boundaries. But Sebastian fought with something Julian had never possessed and could not understand. Righteous fury transmuted into protective ferocity, every blow driven not by selfish desire, but by desperate need to defend what he had failed to defend before, to physically impose consequences upon the brother who had orchestrated such comprehensive destruction, and the force of that purpose gave him strength that transcended mere physical advantage as they grappled and struck and fell together onto the frost-hard ground. Servants began rushing from the house, their shouts of alarm carrying across the December air, and Amelia's father emerged onto the terrace with several footmen, but the fight continued with relentless momentum as the brothers rolled across frozen earth, Sebastian's fist connecting with Julian's ribs in a blow that drove the air from his lungs, Julian's answering strike, opening a cut above Sebastian's eye that sent blood streaming down his face to freeze in the bitter cold, neither giving quarter nor seeking it as years of false civility shattered completely. Amelia stood transfixed, one hand pressed to her mouth, watching Sebastian defend her honor with an intensity and devotion. The cold man who had left her at the altar would never have shown, seeing in his desperate fury the complete transformation of someone who had finally learned what mattered and would destroy himself, protecting it, and something in her chest cracked open at the sight of him, bloodied and relentless, fighting his own brother with everything he possessed because Julian had dared to threaten her, had dared to touch her with violence, had dared to continue the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both. Sebastian finally gained the upper hand through sheer determination, landing a devastating blow that sent Julian sprawling backward onto the frozen path, and he stood over his brother breathing hard, blood dripping from the cut above his eye and from split knuckles, his fine coat torn and his face transformed into something fierce and implacable as Julian lay gasping below him, defeated but still defiant in the twisted set of his features. "You are banished from the family," Sebastian said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite his ragged breathing, each word falling like judgment upon the winter air. "I am disinheriting you from all claims to Ashford properties and fortune, severing your connection to our name, and if you ever approach Miss Hartwell again, if you so much as speak her name, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you completely. Do you understand?" Julian spat blood onto the frozen ground and laughed bitterly, but there was fear beneath his defiance now, recognition that Sebastian wielded power Julian's schemes could never overcome, that the brother he had sought to supplant had finally stopped playing by rules of civility and family loyalty that Julian himself had shattered, and this Sebastian who stood over him with cold fury was far more dangerous than the controlled, proper Marquess Julian had always known and dismissed. Amelia's father, Lord Hartwell, directed 2 of his most robust footmen to remove Julian from the property, and though Julian attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity as he was escorted away, spitting threats about legal action and family scandal, his words rang hollow against the weight of Sebastian's evidence and positioned the recordings of servants' testimony. Margaret's written confession Sebastian had obtained, the documented timeline that proved conspiracy beyond refutation, and they all knew that any attempt Julian made to challenge the banishment would only expose his own machinations to wider scrutiny and destroy what little standing he retained in society. Sebastian stood in the winter garden breathing hard, blood still streaming from the cut above his eye and dripping from his split knuckles onto the frost-hard ground, exhaustion and pain beginning to register now that the fury of combat had passed, and he swayed slightly on his feet as he watched his brother disappear down the drive in disgrace. He had done what he came to do, had protected Amelia from Julian's predation and exposed the conspiracy that had destroyed their wedding day, and now there remained nothing but to leave as he had promised her father he would months ago, to return to the village inn and eventually to London, to live with the knowledge that he had at least managed this one redemptive act, even if forgiveness remained forever beyond his reach. He turned toward the garden gate, each step sending waves of pain through his bruised body, prepared to walk away from the Hartwell estate one final time, when Amelia's voice stopped him as surely as if she had physically grasped his arm. "Lord Ashford, please stay." The words were quiet, tentative, not forgiveness but something more precious in that moment, an opening, a willingness to speak after months of silence, and Sebastian turned back to see her standing pale and shaken in the winter garden, one hand still pressed to the arm Julian had bruised, her eyes wide with something that might have been recognition or reassessment, or simply shock at all that had transpired. Lord Hartwell, who had witnessed the entire confrontation from the terrace, exchanged a long look with his wife, and though fury at the man who had abandoned his daughter still burned in his expression, there was also grudging acknowledgement of what Sebastian had just done, the brother he had fought and banished to protect Amelia, and he gave a curt nod. "Bring him to the drawing room." Sebastian was escorted inside, leaving a trail of blood on the pristine floors that made him flinch with shame, and he was deposited into a chair by the fire while a maid was sent for medical supplies, and then Amelia entered the room, dismissing the hovering servants with quiet authority, and suddenly they were alone for the first time since that terrible wedding day months past. She approached him with basin and cloths, her movements careful and deliberate, and began tending his wounds in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and his barely suppressed flinch when her fingers brushed the cut above his eye, not from pain, though the wound stung fiercely, but from the unbearable tenderness of her touch, the gentleness he had forfeited all right to receive, and tears burned behind his eyes at the grace of this small mercy. "You came," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral as she cleaned blood from his brow. "You came when I needed you. I will always come," he replied hoarsely, the words emerging like a vow. "If you need me, I will always come, even if you never wish to see me otherwise." They sat in chairs drawn close to the fire as winter rain began to fall beyond the windows, painting the December afternoon in shades of grey that somehow made the drawing room feel both sheltered and suspended outside of time, and Sebastian began speaking in a voice scraped raw by emotion and exhaustion, telling Amelia everything he had never intended to confess, how during their formal courtship he had found himself thinking of her at odd moments throughout his days, how her quiet dignity had begun to seem less like resignation and more like strength, how he had caught himself actually looking forward to their stilted conversations and arranging his schedule around the perfunctory calls that duty required, and how this gradual awakening of feelings he had never expected to experience had terrified him, because the Marquess of Ashford was not supposed to care, was not supposed to need, was not supposed to feel his chest tighten when she smiled briefly at something he said, or his pulse quicken when her hand brushed his during a walk through her father's gardens. "I was falling in love with you," he said, his voice breaking on the confession, "and I didn't even fully realize it until that morning when the letter arrived, claiming you had been unfaithful, and the pain of it was so devastating that I understood in that terrible moment just how much I had begun to care, how much I had allowed myself to hope despite every intention to keep our arrangement purely practical, and I couldn't bear it, couldn't bear the thought that you might have seen my growing attachment and laughed at it, that Julian might have known and helped you deceive me, that I had been fool enough to let down my guard only to have my vulnerability exploited." He looked at her directly then, his eyes reddened and fierce with self-recrimination. "So I betrayed you instead, ran like a coward rather than confronting you with the accusation, because some part of me knew even then that if I looked in your eyes and asked the question, I would see your innocence and have to acknowledge that my pride had made me believe lies over the woman I was beginning to love, and I wasn't brave enough for that truth, wasn't strong enough to risk being wrong, so I simply fled and destroyed us both." Tears were streaming down Amelia's face now, her composure finally shattering as she pressed one hand to her mouth, and when she could speak her voice emerged small and wounded. "I had resigned myself to duty, to a marriage without affection because that was what my family needed and what society expected, but then during our courtship I began to notice things about you that no one else seemed to see, the way you spoke gently to servants when you thought no one was listening, how you deflected your steward's suggestion to raise tenant rents even though it would have increased your income, the rare moments when your controlled expression would slip and I would glimpse something warm and almost vulnerable beneath the cold exterior everyone else saw, and I started hoping, started imagining that perhaps our marriage might hold some measure of companionship even if not love, started believing that maybe you were not quite as indifferent as you seemed." She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "And then you didn't come to the church, and I stood there realizing that I had been a fool to hope for anything at all, that you couldn't even be bothered to go through with arrangement you had yourself proposed, and the humiliation was terrible, but the deeper pain was knowing that whatever small connection I thought we were building had been entirely my imagination, that you truly felt nothing for me at all." "I felt everything," Sebastian whispered hoarsely, leaning forward as though he might reach for her hands but stopping himself. "I felt too much, and I handled it with the worst possible cowardice, and I have no right to ask your forgiveness, but I need you to know that my failure was never about your worth. You are everything fine and good that I am not. It was about my own weakness, my pride, my inability to trust in something precious, because I had never learned how to value anything beyond property and position until you showed me what I was missing." The difficult truth settled between them in the following days like sediment slowly drifting to the bottom of disturbed water, and Amelia found that while Sebastian's confession had illuminated the terrible misunderstanding that had destroyed their wedding day and revealed the depth of feeling that had motivated his catastrophic mistake, she could not simply forgive the wound he had inflicted was too deep, carved not just into her heart, but into her public reputation and her family's standing. And the memory of standing alone at that altar, while whispers rose around her like accusatory smoke, remained visceral enough to make her breath catch, even now, when she allowed herself to fully remember it. But she understood now, and understanding was a foundation upon which something might eventually be rebuilt if they both had the courage and patience for the painstaking work. So when Sebastian prepared to return to the village inn after their conversation in the drawing room, she did not ask him to leave the county entirely, and that small mercy seemed to strike him with the force of absolution he did not deserve, his expression transforming with fragile hope that he visibly tried to contain, lest he presume too much. He took rooms again at the Three Crowns, and began calling at the Hartwell estate daily, always proper, always announced, always respectful of whatever boundaries Amelia established. Some days she would receive him for half an hour of careful conversation in the parlour with her mother present. Other days she would send word through the butler that she was not prepared for company, and he would simply bow to the servant and depart without protest, leaving whatever small token he had brought, a book he thought she might enjoy, or hothouse flowers in December's barren cold. Their conversations gradually lengthened as winter deepened, moving from stilted exchanges about weather and neutral topics to more substantial discussions of books and philosophy and their respective childhoods, and Amelia began to see facets of Sebastian she had only glimpsed during their original courtship, his dry humour that emerged in unexpected moments, the keen intelligence he usually kept shuttered behind aristocratic reserve, his surprisingly progressive views on estate management and education that contradicted his reputation for cold calculation. She agreed to walk with him through the winter woods one afternoon, with her maid trailing at a discreet distance, and they moved through the bare trees in companionable silence, broken by occasional observations, and when they encountered the vicar's young children playing near the church, Amelia watched Sebastian crouch down to their level to admire the snowman they had constructed, his praise genuine, and his manner gentle in a way that made something in her chest constrict painfully, with recognition of the father he might someday be, the husband he was trying to prove he could become. The walls she had built around her battered heart were cracking slowly under the patient pressure of his constant presence and evident transformation, and she found herself thinking of him during the hours between his visits, remembering small details, like the way his eyes warmed when she smiled, or how carefully he listened when she spoke, as though her words were precious, texts requiring close study, and she began to recognize that his suffering across these months of separation had matched her own, that he had been as thoroughly destroyed by his mistake as she had been, that his transformation from the cold, controlled Marquess, who had courted her into this raw, devoted man, who appeared daily at her door, regardless of whether she would receive him, was genuine and hard-won, and worthy of acknowledgement, if not yet complete trust. Months passed in this careful dance of rebuilding, winter settling fully over the countryside, with frost patterns on windows and bare branches etched against grey skies, and through the accumulated weight of Sebastian's constant, patient presence, through morning calls that stretched into afternoon conversations, through walks along frozen paths where their breath misted in the cold air, and he would offer his arm with a question in his eyes rather than assumption, through books exchanged with notes in the margins where they carried on written dialogues about philosophy and poetry, through his unfailing respect for every boundary she established, and his visible joy at each small grace she extended. Amelia found herself undertaking an internal journey as transformative as his external one, learning slowly and painfully to trust again, to believe that his devotion was genuine rather than performance, to allow herself to feel the love she had suppressed, first out of duty and then out of self-protection. There were small moments of connection that accumulated like snow, building imperceptibly into drifts that could reshape a landscape. The afternoon she laughed genuinely at his dry observation about the pompous squire, who had called on her father and looked up to find Sebastian watching her with such tender wonder that her breath caught, the evening he arrived, with his cloak dusted with snow, and she helped brush it away without thinking, their hands stilling when they accidentally touched, and neither pulling away for a long, suspended moment. The day they sat reading in companionable silence in her father's library, and she glanced over to find him not reading at all, but simply looking at her as though trying to memorize her profile, and instead of feeling observed, she felt cherished. The turning point came on an afternoon in late February, when they were discussing a particularly complex passage in a volume of essays, and she addressed him as Sebastian rather than Lord Ashford, the intimate use of his given name emerging naturally without conscious decision, and she watched his careful composure crack as emotion flooded his expression, not presumptuous triumph, but humble gratitude that seemed to fracture something in his chest, his voice rough when he whispered, "Thank you," as though she had granted him a gift beyond price rather than simply spoken his name. Her family's acceptance came gradually as well, earned through Sebastian's unwavering dedication and visible transformation. Her father, who had threatened violence in autumn, began conversing with him about estate management and discovered a man of integrity and progressive ideas beneath the aristocratic reserve, while her mother softened when she observed how carefully he attended to Amelia's comfort and how he never presumed upon the access she granted him, but treated each visit as a privilege that might be revoked if he failed to prove himself worthy. But while their private world was slowly healing, society's judgment remained a barrier between them and any public future. Amelia was still the jilted bride, her reputation stained by abandonment, and Sebastian, despite his wealth and title, could not simply announce their reconciliation without subjecting her to fresh scandal and cementing her position as the desperate woman who took back the man who humiliated her. For them to have a real future together, not hidden in the countryside but able to move freely in the world they inhabited, he would need to publicly claim responsibility for what had happened and somehow rehabilitate her reputation in the eyes of the society that had judged her so harshly. And as winter began its slow turn toward spring, they both understood that this reckoning was approaching. That private healing, precious as it was, would not be enough to build the life they were beginning, tentatively, to envision together. Sebastian's grand gesture came in early March, when the London season was just beginning, and the city's ballrooms were filling with society's elite, eager for fresh entertainment and scandal, and he sent invitations for a ball at Ashford House that carried the weight of command rather than mere invitation. The Marquess of Ashford, one of the wealthiest and most powerful peers in England, was hosting his first major social event in nearly a year, and despite the whispers about his failed wedding and mysterious absence from society, no one of consequence could afford to decline without risking his considerable displeasure and the social isolation that would follow. Amelia received her invitation at the Hartwell townhouse, where she had reluctantly accompanied her parents for the season, her stomach twisting with apprehension because Sebastian had not told her of his plans beyond asking her to trust him for one more night, to grant him the opportunity to try to repair what his actions had broken. And though she had agreed because these months had taught her that his word had become inviolable, she felt sick with dread at the thought of facing the society that had whispered about her humiliation and dissected her abandonment as though her pain were merely diverting gossip. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, spring asserting itself early, and Amelia, dressed in pale blue silk with her mother's diamonds at her throat, armor against the judgment she would face. And when their carriage joined the long line approaching Ashford House, she had to concentrate on breathing steadily to calm the racing of her heart. The ballroom was magnificent, ablaze with thousands of candles in crystal chandeliers, banks of hothouse roses despite the season's earliness, and what seemed like all of London society packed into the space, their conversation a roar of speculation and curiosity. And Amelia entered with her parents to feel every eye turn toward her, the whispers starting immediately like wind through dry grass. Sebastian stood near the musicians' gallery, distinguished in black evening clothes, his face composed but his eyes finding hers across the crowded room with an intensity that made her breath catch, and before the dancing could begin, he raised his hand for silence and stepped forward to address the assembly with the absolute authority of his rank and position. What followed was unlike anything London society had witnessed in a generation. The Marquess of Ashford, known for his cold reserve and supreme control, spoke with raw honesty before hundreds of witnesses about the conspiracy that had destroyed his wedding, about Margaret's forged letter and his cousin Julian's betrayal, about his own catastrophic failure to trust the woman he had been beginning to love, about his pride and cowardice that had led him to abandon an innocent woman at the altar rather than face his own vulnerability. He detailed the investigation that had revealed the truth, his months of attempting to earn even the right to apologize, the patient grace Lady Amelia Hartwell, had shown in allowing him to prove through action rather than words that his transformation was genuine, and his voice, carrying to every corner of the now utterly silent ballroom, held such evident self-condemnation and such profound respect for Amelia that even the most hardened gossips found themselves moved despite their hunger for scandal. Then Sebastian did what no one expected. He publicly declared that Amelia was completely innocent of any wrongdoing and the finest woman of character and dignity he had ever known, that he had spent these months earning the impossible privilege of even speaking to her, and that he was offering her now, before all of society, a choice. She could walk away from him with her reputation fully restored by his confession and a settlement generous enough to secure her independence for life. Or she could accept his proposal of marriage made properly this time, not from duty or alliance, but from a heart that had been transformed through suffering into something capable of the devotion she had always deserved. The ballroom held its collective breath as Sebastian turned fully toward Amelia, and in his eyes she saw everything they had traveled through together, the devastation and the patient rebuilding, the pain and the gradual healing, the man he had been and the man he had fought to become, and she understood that he was giving her not just a choice but her power back, offering her the agency his abandonment had stolen, willing to accept her rejection before all these witnesses if that was the justice she required. Amelia felt every eye in the ballroom fixed upon her as Sebastian's proposal hung in the air between them, offering her the choice that would define both their futures, and for a suspended moment she stood frozen, not by fear, but by the profound weight of what this decision meant, not simply whether to accept a proposal of marriage, but whether to publicly declare that healing was possible, that transformation could be genuine, that love could be built from the ruins of devastation through patience and painful honesty. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she stepped forward through the silent crowd that parted before her like water, their avid faces blurring at the edges of her vision, while Sebastian remained in sharp focus, his composure held by the thinnest thread as he watched her approach with such vulnerable hope that she felt her own carefully maintained reserve begin to crack. When she reached him, she did not immediately speak, but stood for a long moment, simply looking at the man before her, not the cold Marquess who had assessed her like livestock in her father's drawing room, not the coward who had fled rather than trust her, but the man who had spent months proving through action rather than words that he had been transformed by his failures into someone capable of the devotion he had once been too proud and too frightened to offer. Then Amelia turned to address the assembly with a steady voice that carried her own strength, her own agency reclaimed, and she spoke of the pain that Sebastian's abandonment had caused, acknowledging it honestly rather than pretending society's judgment had not wounded her. But she also spoke of the long road they had traveled together through autumn and winter into early spring, of the patience he had shown in respecting every boundary she established, of the genuine remorse that had driven him not to make excuses, but to take full responsibility and work tirelessly to become worthy of a second chance he knew he might never receive. She told them that she had witnessed his transformation not through grand gestures alone, but through accumulated small moments of tenderness and respect, through his protection of her from further harm, through his willingness to endure society's contempt and her own anger without complaint, because he understood it was what justice required. And she declared that the man standing before her now was not the man who had left her at the altar, but someone who had been broken by his own pride and rebuilt into something stronger and infinitely more precious through the painful process of genuine change. Then, her voice softening but remaining clear enough for every witness to hear, Amelia accepted his proposal with words that were not effusive but deeply sincere. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you not because you are a Marquess or because society's opinion has been restored, but because you have proven yourself to be a man of honor and genuine feeling, and because I have learned through our shared suffering that love built through adversity and hard-won trust is stronger than any affection that comes easily." The ballroom erupted into noise, gasps and whispers, and even some genuine applause from those moved by the extraordinary drama they had witnessed. But Amelia was aware only of Sebastian's face, as tears he did not bother to hide slipped down his cheeks, and he reached for her hand with such careful reverence as though she were something precious and fragile. And when she placed her fingers in his palm, his hand closed around them with gentle strength, while he whispered words only she could hear. I will spend every day of my life proving worthy of this grace." Their engagement became official amid scandal and approval in equal measure. Society unable to decide whether to condemn the impropriety or celebrate the romance, but neither Sebastian nor Amelia cared for anyone's opinion save their own, and in the weeks that followed they planned a second wedding that would contrast absolutely with the failed first attempt. The morning of their wedding arrived in late April with spring fully established, apple blossoms drifting like snow and morning light, golden rather than the harsh brightness that had illuminated Amelia's first abandonment, and this time when she entered the small church they had chosen intimate rather than grand, witnesses who genuinely cared for them rather than society's curious masses. She found Sebastian already at the altar, where he had been waiting since dawn, unable to stay away, his face showing visible nervousness that made him somehow more rather than less appealing, because it revealed how much this moment mattered to him, how afraid he was that even now something might prevent their union. His eyes never left the door during the minutes before the ceremony began, and when Amelia appeared in a gown of ivory silk with orange blossoms in her hair, his expression transformed into such radiant joy and relief that several guests found themselves moved to tears by the raw emotion they witnessed. Amelia walked toward him with steady steps and a peaceful smile, no father leading her this time because she came of her own choice and her own will, and when she reached Sebastian and placed her hand in his, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her his composure was hard won. The vows they spoke carried meanings only they fully understood when Sebastian promised to honor and cherish her. His voice broke slightly on the words because they both remembered how he had failed to honor her before, and when Amelia promised to love and trust him, she met his eyes with such steady certainty that he understood she meant it, despite every reason she had to withhold that trust. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian leaned close enough that his whispered words reached only her ears. "I'm here, Amelia. I will always be here." Their first kiss as husband and wife was tender and careful and infinitely precious, the kiss of two people who understood exactly how fragile happiness could be and how much courage it required to claim it anyway, and when they drew apart and turned to face their small gathering of loved ones as the Marquess and Marchioness of Ashford, their joined hands and shared glance of perfect understanding told everyone present that this marriage, born from devastation and rebuilt through painful honesty, was stronger than any union that had never been tested by adversity and chosen again anyway. 2 years had passed since that April wedding, when spring had blessed their union with apple blossoms and golden light, and the Ashford country estate in Hampshire now basked in the full glory of summer, with roses climbing the stone walls and bees humming their drowsy songs among the lavender that bordered the garden paths where Amelia walked in the early breeze. Evening, her muslin dress the color of cream, moving gently in the warm breeze that carried the scent of new-mown hay from the distant fields. She paused beside the fountain where water splashed over moss-covered stone, her hand resting on the sun-warmed marble edge, and her face held an expression of such peaceful contentment that she seemed almost luminous in the honeyed light. All the sharp edges of past pain softened into something stronger and more beautiful for having been tested and survived. Sebastian emerged from the house with their daughter Catherine in his arms. The infant, just 4 months old and already showing signs of her mother's delicate features and her father's dark hair, and the sight of the Marquess of Ashford, once known throughout London for his cold reserve and proud isolation, cooing nonsense to his child with such tender devotion, would have astonished anyone who had known him in those days before. Devastation had cracked him open and allowed his capacity for love to finally emerge. He crossed the lawn to where Amelia waited, and she turned at his approach, with a smile that held such warmth and genuine affection that his heart still caught at the gift of it, still marveled that she had chosen to forgive him and build this life together from the ruins of what his pride had nearly destroyed forever. Their life together was not the cold alliance of convenience their first engagement had promised, but rather a genuine partnership built on hard-won trust and honest communication. They had learned through suffering to speak truthfully, even when truth was difficult, to choose vulnerability over pride, to remember always how precious and how fragile happiness could be when it had been lost and then reclaimed through patience and genuine transformation. Sebastian handed Catherine to Amelia with the careful reverence he always showed when touching either of them, as though he never quite forgot how close he had come to losing the right to this domestic joy. and Amelia settled their daughter against her shoulder, while reaching with her free hand for Sebastian's fingers, their hands joining with the comfortable ease of long familiarity as they stood together watching the sun begin its descent toward the western hills that bounded their estate. In the warm silence broken only by Catherine's soft baby sounds and the evening birdsong, they were simply and completely happy, not with the easy happiness of those who had never known pain, but with the deeper contentment of two people who had traveled through devastation together and chosen each time to keep building toward something better, something real, something earned through countless small acts of patience and faith and courage. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard in this story an echo of your own struggles with pride or betrayal, with the question of whether people can truly change or whether trust once broken can ever be fully restored. And if so, then know that Sebastian and Amelia's journey holds a truth that applies to all our lives, that the deepest love is often born not from easy affection, but from overcoming the deepest pain together, from choosing again and again to believe in transformation, even when every past experience argues for cynicism and retreat. The courage required to forgive is matched only by the courage required to accept forgiveness and work daily to prove worthy of it, and both require a vulnerability that pride resists with every fiber, but that genuine connection demands absolutely. We are none of us perfect beings. We fail those we love. We allow fear and pride to drive us to actions we later recognize as cowardly or cruel. We make choices in moments of pain that create more pain in their wake. But we are also capable of genuine transformation when we stop making excuses and start taking responsibility, when we prove through patient action rather than empty promises that we have learned from our failures and become someone stronger and more worthy of the love we nearly destroyed. Not all betrayals can be forgiven, and forgiveness itself is not owed to anyone regardless of their remorse. But when both parties are willing to do the difficult work of honest examination and gradual rebuilding, when the person who caused harm shows through sustained effort that their change is genuine, and the person who was harmed finds the courage to risk trusting again, despite every reason for caution, then something profound can emerge from even the deepest devastation, a love that knows exactly what it cost and values it accordingly, a partnership built on truth rather than illusion, a happiness that endures because it was tested by fire and chose to survive. May you find in your own life the courage to transform your failures into opportunities for growth, to offer grace where it is genuinely earned, and to believe that even from our worst moments can come our greatest redemptions if we are willing to do the hard and humble work that genuine change requires. And may your nights be peaceful with the knowledge that love, real love, is not the absence of struggle but the choice to keep building even when building is difficult, to keep trusting even when trust is frightening, to keep hoping even when hope seems foolish, because the alternative to close yourself off from connection to avoid potential pain is not safety, but merely a different kind of devastation, a slower dying of the spirit that genuine love, however hard won, can heal.